On this week's episode, we are going to be revisiting a topic we touched on some time ago. We are going to be discussing issues involving the current pandemic. The question we are going to be dealing with is, does caution show a lack of faith? Issues surrounding the pandemic and the vaccine are polarizing. They are polarizing in the world and they are polarizing in the church. So let's talk about it. Does caution show a lack of faith? On this week's episode of Ears to Hear. Thanks for joining us. Again, we'd like to thank you for joining us this week. And just a lovely song, a lovely hymn, Faith of Our Fathers. Mm-hmm. And as I said, we're going to be talking about, does caution show a lack of faith? Andrew, how are you doing this week?
John, I'm doing well.
Is this a case of fools rush in where angels fear to tread, which, funny enough, is the very thing we're actually talking about, being cautious, and
right,
maybe we should show more caution before talking about this subject.
Yeah.
But it is a subject that is, of course, on a lot of people's mind. So get us going. What's the issue?
Yeah, well, it's something that, everybody has an opinion on. And so, as we talk about this, we'll try to be careful to be aware of that and not come down, too hard or anything. The goal is not to get all preachy on you, but...
Don't denigrate preachers, Andrew. Go ahead, though.
I can't use that word then. But...
only I can use that word.
I'd say as a general way to split up, I think there's kind of two camps that people fall into. And again, it's generalizing, but it frames the conversation. We know from Scripture that nothing can separate us from the love of God. No powers, no principalities, nothing in this world can separate us from the love that God has for us. And yet we can look at that, and there's kind of different opinions that people can form sort of with that in mind. One camp of people might say, well, if nothing can keep me from the love of God, then nothing's going to stop me. Nothing's going to hold me back, and I should have faith and not be overly concerned with being cautious or earthly medicine or the efforts of man's intervention to keep me safe. I'm just going to throw it all on God and trust in God.
And perhaps not be concerned at all.
Maybe it goes so far as to say, right. Show no caution. Just completely trust in God's outcome and God's will.
And folks who take that view, and there are folks who take that view in the religious world, and they see any caution as a lack of faith. Mm-hmm. That's how they address these matters. Go ahead.
Right. And then there's another side to it too, which is one that says, our faith in God is based on the fact that God will help us weather through challenges in life, but that he gives us the strength to endure it. But it doesn't mean that the situation is taken away or that any need for us to be careful is removed. We still live in a world where our actions in the world have physical consequences. And so, yes, we trust in God to guide us through making decisions and trying to show caution. But that it is worthwhile to try to preserve oneself, in the context of a pandemic, and whether it's getting a vaccine or whether it's wearing a mask, trying to do something to protect yourself and others can still doesn't show a lack of faith. That's sort of the other camp.
Yeah, and we'll say in thinking about the topic of this week's podcast, you had mentioned that a passage I read in the sermon this past Sunday, and you quoted from it from Romans chapter 8, what shall separate us from the love of Christ? And the point Paul is making there is not, when it's shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or peril, all those things shall not separate us from the love of the Lord. That does not mean that those things will not happen. when he says neither life nor death. Well, one of those two things is going to happen, and eventually, in all likelihood, unless the Lord returns, both those things are going to happen.
Right.
So he's not saying you will not face trials. You will not. He's not saying the Lord is going to remove you from these trials. He's saying you can face this.
Right.
And in facing this, the Lord will be with you, and you will not be separated from the love of the Lord as you endure, like you said.
Right.
Go ahead.
That's sort of the second mentality that I brought up to put the topic that we're discussing into the context of that verse. You could say, no amount of whatever safety precautions we have to take, whatever limitations we need to put on ourselves and our lifestyle so that we're not being a risk to people, that still won't separate us from the love of God. We can do those things and we can endure those things and still have access to the love of God. It doesn't separate us from our ability to experience that.
Yeah. Okay, so where do we want to go now?
Well, I think we had a couple passages in Proverbs that we wanted to look at first, kind of that show just the idea of being prudent. There are some passages where the Bible talks about this, and one that we had was in Proverbs 22, verse 3, in which it says, "The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it." And just the idea there of, God expects us to show common sense, and God expects us to be able to get out of the way if there's something that's about to hit us. So it's kind of the idea of, walk carefully, look around as you are living and walking, and try to avoid getting into unnecessary trouble and danger.
Yeah, a passage that comes to mind just as you say that in Ephesians, it talks about that we should be redeeming the time, walking circumspectly.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I was having that in mind as well. Couldn't remember the reference. But.
Just that idea of prudence.
Yes,
and that is what we are called to have. Now there is a balance there, but it starts here. The Lord wants us to be prudent. He doesn't want us to be simpletons. He doesn't want us to foolishly disregard everything that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever's happening, whatever situation we find ourselves in, we take stock of it, and we're careful. I was thinking about when the Lord sends out the disciples, and he says, "I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves." Right. And he says, "I want you to be as innocent as doves, but at the same time," it's the strange verse where I think it talks about cunning as
serpents.
He wants them to use their head. But he is putting them in danger's way.
Right.
And that's somewhat of an oddity as we talk about this, that he was sending out the disciples as sheep in the midst of wolves. And it was a dangerous time. But here, the Lord wants us to be prudent.
Right.
So that's one verse that we wanted to start with. What's the second one? Is it in chapter 26?
I can't remember.
Yeah, it's chapter 26 at verse 13, where it says, "The lazy man says, there is a lion in the road, a fierce lion in the streets."
Mm-hmm.
So here's an individual, and this individual is lazy, by the way. But he says, "I'm not going to go outside just in case."
Mm-hmm.
There's a lion, and I understand he's looking for an excuse, and we'll probably talk more about that as we go along. But there's a lion in the road. Is there really a lion in the road? Probably not. But we might come back to that idea as well. There may be a lion in the road. And it's like, what do you got to do? Anyway, we'll come back to that, though.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the balance.
Right.
Here's a person who is prudent, who is cautious, and they are careful. And they do not rush out hastily.
Right.
But then there's the balance of... And the other end of the spectrum, there's an individual who never goes out just in case. And they are overly cautious.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord wants us to be cautious, but bad things start happening when we become overly cautious.
Right. When it gets into the realm of inactivity, which is another way of putting laziness or being a sluggard, right. Caution starts to breed other problems when we let it hinder us from any activity at all.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So given that, because that's the that is the line we are trying to toe.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be careful, but if our taking care crosses the line into, frankly, to a place where the Lord doesn't want us to be, where we're fearful and we're paranoid and we're overly cautious. We're trying to toe that line between being careful and being overly careful.
Mm-hmm.
Carry on. I'll stop ranting.
Well, the next thing I thought of was just, what are some examples of maybe people in Scripture who either showed caution or a lack of caution? Because when you think about it, there's a lot of examples of people who really show no regard for self when it comes to displays of faith. You have David facing Goliath, knowing that the Lord will win the battle for him and protect him, even refusing Saul's armor. Of course, I think
Didn't fit.
In that case, it probably wouldn't have helped him, so he probably made a good decision there. And then we look to others, in the New Testament. You look at examples like Paul as he preached, and in numerous passages, Paul went into length of the things that he suffered and the dangers that he willingly put himself into, even going immediately back into a city that had just beaten him and told him to get out and stop preaching. He turned around and went right back and started preaching in the same place, knowing that it was going to be dangerous, but he didn't have any regard for the danger. And Stephen, who, he spoke, we talked about a little bit before we began, how he spoke knowing the risk that he was putting himself into, and what happened. He was stoned. He was killed for it, for speaking boldly against the Jewish council.
Right.
And I think we look at those examples and think, well, I want to be like Paul. I want to be like Stephen. I want to plant my feet and dig my heels into the dirt and say, I'm not going to be moved, and we're going to make a stand, and that this is the hill we're going to die on. But then as I thought about it, there's also examples in Scripture of being told not to do that, or people not necessarily doing that. One of them is in Matthew chapter 24. And in this passage, here Jesus is talking about the coming judgment against Judah and the coming judgment against Jerusalem. And he says in verse 15 there, speaking to the people in the city, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back and take his cloak." And then he says that it's going to be hard for people, but that they're going to have to flee. When the danger comes, it's not going to make sense for them to be planted and dig their heels in. He says the city's going to be destroyed, and if you won't show caution and if you won't heed the warning, you'll be destroyed with it. So just an example of a call to self-preservation. And I understand it was war and judgment that was coming, but a calamity nonetheless. There's some comparisons.
It's just an odd thing, and it's, I'm just saying, like when Peter and James were in prison, and James is beheaded, but then an angel comes and rescues Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, why didn't you come a day earlier to rescue James?
Yep.
And that's the Lord's end of the stick, and I'm not going to whittle on it. There is a time to be a martyr. Whether we're talking about Jesus, whether we're talking about Stephen, whether we're talking about Peter, Jesus says they're going to take you where you don't want to go when you're older. Whatever the case may be, there is a time to be a martyr. But then, and this has come up recently in the adult class, there's also a time where Paul escapes in the basket right after he becomes a Christian.
Right.
Well, why didn't he stand there and fight it out? And, why wasn't he willing to die right then for the gospel? He probably was willing to die, but that's not what he was called to do there.
Right.
And there's a time to get out of town. When Jesus is talking to them and he says, listen, if people do not receive the message, he doesn't say stay there, keep, slamming your head into the wall. He says shake the dust off your feet and move on.
Right.
There's a time to move on. There's a time to get out of town, like with Jerusalem. There's a time to flee. There's a time to stay and fight, like Stephen. But there's, after that Stephen account, persecution arises and everybody scatters.
Mm-hmm.
Well, was it wrong for them to scatter? I don't think so. Was it wrong for Stephen to be a martyr? I don't think so either.
No, in doing so, the same passage says that the word spread along with
Right.
them. So they were emboldened by Stephen's display of
Right.
faith and his boldness in sticking true to the message and not caving to the Jews. And I think we'll talk some more about this in a bit. It all boils down to what are you able to accomplish by standing firm and being bold versus being cautious.
What are you able to accomplish? What are your motives?
What are your motives and what are you able to accomplish? One more example before we get further into that. One of the kind of unique things about the pandemic situation is, it's easy to say, well, I don't care what happens to me. And maybe those who preach the word, they don't have a regard for their own safety because they're just being sacrificial that way. But there's an element of also trying to keep other people safe as well. And I think there's an example of that in Acts chapter 12. And this is the account when Peter was imprisoned right after James was killed. You'd mentioned it earlier. And then he's rescued by the angel. And he goes to the house where the church in the city was gathering. This is in Acts chapter 12. There's the whole account of him knocking, and Mary opens the door, and or the servant girl, Rhonda, she opens the door. She recognizes him, runs back in. They don't believe her. And then when they come out, verse 16, Peter continued knocking, and when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." Then he departed and went to another place. So the example here, and then we see once he leaves, the Herod and the authorities,
they're searching for
things
him.
are hot in the city.
Yeah.
And so Peter gets out and he tells them, he motions for them to be quiet because he is seeking the preservation of the church there. He knows that they're going to be in danger if
he's trying to keep. It looks like he's trying to keep them safe by departing to another place.
Right. And so, was Peter cowardly in doing this? Was Peter, being overly cautious? Peter knew that there was greater utility in keeping the church alive and helping to keep people alive. So he showed caution in this instance, where other times he was more bold and cared less about his own self-preservation.
Yeah, and I was just in thinking about it. It is somewhat of an individual's decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one reason that Paul did not have a family to be concerned about.
Right.
He was not married. He didn't have kids. He was obviously concerned about the church. He says at one point, all the things that happened to him, the shipwrecks, the beatings, on and on and on. And he says none of those things fazed him. What came upon him daily was his deep concern for all the churches.
Right.
So as far as he was concerned, he said, I die daily.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there was a time where he was let down in a basket. There's going to be other times where, he's in Thessalonica for like 3 weeks and then he goes to another place and he's all over the place.
Yeah. Paul even says in other places that, he thinks about it's no harm to him whether he lives or dies, because for him to live is Christ and to die is gain.
And if he died, he would depart and be with the Lord.
Right.
But to stay would be better for the brethren because he would be able to serve them and edify them and things like that.
Yeah. And we start to see a common thread in these examples, which is the motivation for whether we stand firm or yield to caution. It has to do with what are we doing for other people, and are we serving other people in doing it? Right.
And that's the common thread. A few verses that I just jotted down, just as we're thinking about, does caution show a lack of faith? And this is, we've touched on some of these verses before. 1 Timothy 5, verse 23, when Paul tells Timothy, drink a little wine for your stomach's sake. Did that show a lack of faith on either Paul or Timothy's part? No. We've touched before when we talked about exercise. Bodily exercise profits a little, godliness profitable for all things. So does that mean taking care of yourself shows a lack of faith? No, this is what the Lord wants us to do. So some of those same concepts will apply. What other verses or what other ideas do we need to think about, Andrew?
I guess what I was thinking about too was just why do we not need to fear? And I think what it boils down to is sort of what we talked about at the onset of this discussion was the reason we don't need to fear is not because we think that God's just going to wipe away all the difficulties. It's because we know that God is faithful to stay with us even when there is trouble.
Right.
And that's the idea in Hebrews chapter 13. If I can...
as you turn over there, I'm just thinking about, when Jesus is talking to the disciples and he says, don't fear those who can kill the body, but fear those who can kill the body and soul in hell. And he talks about the very hairs of talking to the disciples, the hairs of your head are all numbered. And that doesn't mean that the disciples and the apostles were not going to end up giving their lives for the gospel. They were going to face, we're going through 1 Corinthians right now in the adult class. And when Paul says he thinks that God has displayed them as a spectacle, the apostles, and it's the idea of almost like a theater, and men who are condemned to death. And that's what they were. That's what they were facing.
Yep.
And for the Lord to say, do not fear those who can kill the body. And it's like, that doesn't mean that they weren't going to die, because they were going to die. But they moved in godly fear, and that's what we are called to do as well. Go ahead. What's your verse in Hebrews?
Yeah, here in Hebrews 13, in verses 5 and 6, he's talking to them about, continuing to basically do the works of love. He says, let brotherly love continue in the beginning of that chapter. He tells them to, keep on remembering those who are in prison. He says, for their marriages to be pure. And then he says in verse 5, be content with what you have, for he said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, and then he's quoting here, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me?
Right.
So it all stems back to we don't need to fear, because we know that even if we are being cautious, and even if we have to give up certain things for the sake of caution, that's not going to separate us from the love of God, and God's still our helper even through those things.
And even, what can man do to me? What's the worst thing that can happen? Regardless of whatever the situation is, down throughout history, what's the worst that can happen? You can die. Well, it just so happens we believe in the resurrection. Well, if you believe in the resurrection, are you going to fear death? No, you're not going to fear death. The Lord has the trump card. And it's, I'm not speaking about the past president. I'm talking about he has the power over death.
Right.
And that's what the resurrection is. So what can man do to me? It's like, that's the worst that can happen.
Yeah. And again, that's not saying that we throw ourselves at danger or we seek death for our own gain.
Right.
That would be a misguided idea of this. But you're right. It's ultimately, we know that the victory has already been won by God, so we don't have to be concerned with the ultimate outcome for ourselves. In the meantime, use the tools that God's given us, looking back at Proverbs, use prudence, because God expects us to continue to be busy and to continue to do what we can. We can't let it stagnate our efforts or keep us from working.
Yeah. As we talk about this, right now in the adult class, we're talking about liberties. And liberties, and we've touched on liberties before, they are individual in nature. And some of the things we're talking about, the prudence of one person may not be the prudence of another person. And like you said, at the beginning, everybody's got opinions. And I think, would you also say everybody has convictions? Now, whether those convictions are based on...
It's possible to be someone of little or no conviction, I think. But...
well, just because you don't agree with their convictions.
Sorry, John.
But I mean, everybody has opinions. Yeah. Everybody has to decide for themselves. Right. And we know, like I said, this is a polarizing topic. And that means there are people who are going to say yay. There are going to be people who are going to say nay. And in matters of liberty, we know what's said. Whether you eat or don't eat, do all to the glory of God. Right? Whatever you do it to the Lord. Now, and I was thinking about this idea. Okay, so in thinking about caution, why is the caution being shown? And this goes to what you mentioned earlier. We're getting to an issue of motives.
Right.
And that thread through all the passages that we've looked at. So why is caution being shown? And I think sometimes it is people are just scared.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of our verses have to be considered. We should not be scared.
Right.
And if we are scared, if we are paranoid, if we are getting paranoid, and I think a lot of people are getting, they do fall into that camp, well, then something's wrong. And I mean, last time I checked, it's like we can talk about vaccines all day long. We're all going to die at some point. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that flippantly. I'm saying the Lord in his resurrection is the only real answer for death.
Right.
Whatever doctors and organizations do. So if we're just scared of dying, we need to examine our faith, and we need to buckle down and make sure we're doing and thinking how we should be thinking. But why is caution being shown? Some people are scared. I think some people are just lazy.
Right.
And I don't want to start another podcast on this, but we canceled this past Sunday evening services. And I hope everybody was saddened by that fact. I hope nobody said, well, I'm glad they canceled it because I really didn't want to go anyway.
Right.
And I worry that mindset, to think about another picture, the employment picture, the economy. Well, I'm glad that the government is doing this because I really didn't want to go to work anyway. That's laziness. Mm-hmm. And if people are being cautious just because, frankly, they don't want to leave, they don't want to go out. They don't want to get out. They want to stay home. And that's what that passage in Proverbs is about. The lazy man doesn't even, puts his hand in the bowl and he's too lazy to bring it up and feed himself. If this is just laziness, then that is not a good motivation for caution.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about. These are bad reasons, whether it's outright fear or laziness. Yeah. Go ahead.
And then even caution doesn't really become the reason, it becomes the excuse.
Exactly.
You're more interested in yourself, in just pleasing yourself, in being lazy.
Right.
But when asked about it, caution can sometimes become the thing we hide behind. Oh, I'm just doing this to be careful. Oh, I'm just doing this to,
right.
Yeah.
And that's the third thing, your idea of selfishness. It's if that's what this is about, if this is just about me, if it's just about saving my own bacon, and it's just about I don't want to get this, I don't want to get that, I want to be safe, me, that's not a good motivation either. Mm-hmm. And now we have the good motivation. Why is caution being shown? If it's being shown for others,
right?
If we're thinking about others, then that's a good reason.
Mm-hmm.
If we're thinking, okay, I'm going to make this decision, whatever that decision is, and I'm going to serve others, and I'm going to serve the Lord. And that is a good motivation.
Yeah, and one that is crucially important, especially with this scenario, because as we've heard many times now, and as we've seen played out, it's not just about whether you're willing to get sick. It's about whether you're willing to keep others safe too. And that's a motivation that's looking at other people more than it's looking at what we want to do.
And there's going to be a flip side of that argument, mm-hmm. and we'll get to it here in just a second. But that's those ideas. Why is caution being shown? If it's fear, it's not a good motivation. If it's laziness, it's not a good motivation. If it's selfishness, it's not a good motive. If it's for others, okay, now let's look at it from another way. Why am I being bold?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If some people are being bold or emboldened, however you want to look at it, I don't know. How should I phrase it? I feel like I'm being preachy now.
Yeah.
Not throwing caution to the wind, but pressing on.
Ignoring the warnings, maybe.
I hate to say ignoring the warnings, but pushing on.
Right.
Let's go back to the line in the street. if there is a lion in the street, what do you got to do? You got to deal with it.
Yeah.
Someone's going to have to deal with it. Someone's going to have to go out there. You know, you mentioned David and Goliath. When David first comes up Saul and Saul, you know, and Saul's like, "What are you doing?" And he says, "If there was a bear, I would handle it. If there was a lion, I would handle it." Sometimes you have to handle those things. Okay. So that idea of boldness, not ignoring caution, but pushing on regardless. If a person is doing that just to draw attention to themselves, that is not a good motive.
Right.
If this is just look at me, that is not a good motive. If the person is just being defiant, there's a time to be defiant. You've already mentioned some of them. You know, Peter, Paul, the apostles, Jesus. There were times where they were extremely defiant. But they were not being defiant just for defiance sake. And we are called to be submissive. And some people just have a lot of problem with submission. And it's like, we're supposed to submit to each other. We're supposed to submit to the elders. We're supposed to submit to governments. We're supposed to be a submissive people. Now, is there a time to not be submissive? Yes. But some people, it is just seemingly in their... they are defiant in all situations. If someone tells them to do something, they are going to be oppositional.
Right.
And that's not a good motive. If they're just being oppositional, just to be oppositional.
It shouldn't, taking risks shouldn't be something just to separate us from the crowd or make it so that we're not going along with everybody else.
Yep. So it's not a good motivation. If a person is being bold just because they're being careless, and this goes back to our very first passage, if they're just not being prudent, that is not a good motive. If they are going out, if they are just rushing out, the foolish man goes out and does not care. The Lord wants us to be careful. But if a person is being bold, and now we're back to our common thread, if they are pushing on to help others, if they are even putting themselves in danger to help others, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's an individual's decision. But, I mean, we see it time and time again in Scripture where people were bold.
Right.
Not for their own sake, but for the sake of others.
Yeah. It wasn't thrill-seeking or
No.
showing off, but it was to serve. But the apostles, when they were bold, they did that because it was an example of keeping the faith in the face of someone telling them not to, in the face of direct opposition from, I don't just mean, not to say that sometimes people think they're being oppressed when they're not. This was real direct oppression of the message. Right. And that's the thing that they pushed against. That's the thing that they showed the example to the church and to everyone who saw it, that they were not going to, that they ought to serve God rather than men. That was their words.
Yep. Okay, you mentioned a little bit ago the idea of, and I don't feel like beating around the bush anymore, getting the vaccine because you are concerned for others. You don't want others to get sick. That concept. I'm not saying I agree with it, not saying I disagree with it, but just that concept of you're getting the vaccine out of concern for others. Or you are being cautious, and let's just generalize it at that point. You are being cautious for the sake of others. And in my notes, you have a contrast, and you have, because the common thread, what we should be doing is serving others.
Right.
That's what we should be doing. And I think this is where a big issue comes up. Because can you serve others and still be an isolationist? And that's the rub. Right.
Yeah, you'd brought up an example, because I think there are good examples. Say there's someone who needs transportation or needs care, who's sick, and someone needs to care for them. In that case, you're putting yourself in a risky situation, in a situation of more danger, but you're doing it
You're
to
still
serve.
careful, by the way. You can still do it carefully.
You can still do it carefully. You can still do things to show as much caution as possible.
Right.
You could get the vaccine. You can, have them wear a mask.
Generalize it, Andrew. Generalize it.
Oh, you went specific earlier, so now
I
I'm going
know.
specific.
I know.
So
It's my fault.
there's definitely ways you can still show caution, but yeah, if it's for the good of someone else and saying I'm doing this because it's a benefit to someone else more
Right.
than for me. It's denying yourself to elevate someone else.
And I think anytime you do that, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Anytime you esteem others better than yourself, whether you do or you don't do, and now we're back to liberties again. You're considering someone else based on their situation. And if you do or don't do for them,
Mm-hmm.
then I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. And if it's a matter of defiance, ask yourself this. If you're saying it's my freedom, you can't take my freedom away from me, I'm going to cling to my freedom. If someone who says that is not doing something, if it is not doing
Right.
anything with that freedom, they're not doing anything to serve other people more, then they're just doing it for themselves. There's no gain in that.
I don't suppose you can remember that and say it all again, can you?
Let me see here.
Because it's
If
this is my freedom.
if you're clinging to my freedom, but you're not doing anything more with that freedom to serve other people,
You didn't quote it exactly the same.
that's close enough.
Because it was, this is my freedom,
Right.
my rights. This is my body. This is me. And it's like, something's wrong there.
Right.
Because that is selfishness. That is the tax collector and the Pharisee prays thus with himself. I thank thee that I'm not like other men. I do this. I give tithes of all that I possess. I fast. I.
And Jesus said they do it to be seen.
They do it to be seen. The foolish farmer, right? I will say to myself, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your, it's it's all about me. If this is all about me, if it's all about me, whether I do or don't do, it's wrong.
Right.
Because it's all about me. And it gets back to, we have to think about others.
And to the credit of the flip side, whether I do or don't do, if it's for others, then
Right.
that's the nobler
Right.
cause. Now, I still do believe that there's reason you can do so and still be cautious. I'm not saying,
Right.
to throw away caution or to ignore
Right.
prudence, but
Right.
if the motivation is others, then that's when we know we're not doing it to serve ourselves.
Yes, very much so. And in my notes, I closed out my notes this way. If the message is diminished, and I'm talking about the gospel, if the gospel is diminished, something's wrong. And I stand by that. I think, and that's one of the dangers that happens, that the church is the pillar and the ground of the truth, and we are the body of Christ, and we are to hold up the truth. And if we do not hold it as high as we should, if the message is diminished, something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And if it robs God, our God is still a jealous God, regardless of whatever epidemic or pandemic or whatever else. God is still a jealous God,
Mm-hmm.
and he is worthy of our worship. And if something diminishes our service and worship, and I understand if people are sick, if someone's sick, the Lord understands that. We understand that. But we need to recognize what we were created for
Mm-hmm.
one thing. And it's, thou shalt love the Lord thy God and your neighbor as yourself. And if you're not doing those two things, then the whole foundation's off.
Yeah.
And, the early verse that we looked at, the lion in the street. The lazy man says there's a lion in the street. There may be a lion in the street, and there is a lion in the street, and it's the devil. The devil, right? Seeking whom he may devour.
Mm-hmm.
And the devil is more than happy when the gospel is diminished.
Yep.
if we focus on me and not on others, if I'm not serving others and if I'm not worshiping the Lord, the devil is pleased as punch. So what we have to do is remember what we're called to, and be careful, be prudent.
Be prudent, but do what you can.
Yeah, do what you can. And a lot of times it falls into the individual's decision, and we're called to be prudent, be careful, but it's up to the individual to decide exactly what that looks like. But if it's all about themselves, and right, everything we've already said, I'm not going to repeat it all. Anyway, good conversation. Appreciate everyone tuning in. Appreciate it, Andrew.
Yep. Appreciate you, John.
Yep. I hope you have a good week. I hope everybody who's tuned in has a good week, and I hope this week's episode has been helpful. We appreciate you having ears to hear, and we will see you next week. Thanks for being with us.
Sweet would be